Hey everyone, it's Dr. Steph, and we're back for part 2 of our Planning for Pregnancy series. In this part, we will discuss both the medical and financial side of when you do get pregnant and after giving birth. We will discuss employment insurance, or EI, the pregnancy leave program for physicians, and affording baby supplies and daycare. If you find this helpful, leave a like and subscribe. If you have a question, leave us a comment. So let's begin this conversation. So let's move on to talking about pregnancy, because when you finally did get pregnant, that must have been a big change in your work and your personal life. And that can be pretty overwhelming. Like, for example, you might need to find a pediatrician or find a family doctor for your child. You have to notify your workplace. Where did you kind of start once that happened?
Yes. So once I became pregnant, I was again very fortunate because I was an OBGYN resident. So I certainly knew a lot about pregnancy. I knew what to expect. What took me still a little bit by surprise was how tough the first trimester was. That was actually probably the toughest time of my whole pregnancy, because the nausea was pretty debilitating. I was somebody who required multiple nausea medications. I never actually vomited, so I didn't have an observable issue, which sometimes was a little bit to my detriment because I would feel very, very nauseous, but nobody knew whether or not I was feeling okay. And so again, it was really up to me to tell people, I'm really not feeling well. I can't do XYZ because of XYZ. And there were certain cases in which I had to speak to my rotation supervisors, maybe sooner than I was willing to disclose things very specifically and say, I can't be in the OR today, for example. I'm really not feeling well enough to be doing this. And for me, that was what I needed at the time. And I had to do for myself. And I think that that's another thing I'd like to share, with people who are in medical programs. Sometimes you just have to advocate for yourself because you can't control whether or not you feel nauseous or vomiting or you feel unwell. And it's better that you disclose that than to suffer through it and potentially not accomplish what you need to do. So that was the other part. I wasn't expecting the first trimester to be so hard, but it was hard for me. And then I had a little bit of a bright spot in my second trimester. And then in my third trimester, it was also very tough, but I got all the supports, the compression socks, the lumbar belt, as much as I could get into place so that I could work at the capacity I was working before. In my particular situation, I actually didn't have a lot of flexibility in terms of my rotation scheduling. So I was actually on very tough rotations near the end, and I operated until I was about 36, 37 weeks pregnant and was on very, very tough. Like for us, gynecologic oncology is our toughest rotation in terms of being in the hospital and operating. And that's what I was on when I actually went and had my baby. I took, some time off to go off and get induced. So that was challenging because I had to still work at the same capacity that I would have worked at. And I also wanted to get that experience out of my rotation. And though I did try to actually switch the rotations, it was much harder to switch rotations than to switch call shifts. So I actually was not successful in switching those rotations. And that was probably one of those moments where I really felt like a medical resident. Like there were things that I absolutely had to accomplish, and I didn't really have a lot of agency in changing the way things were for me at the time.
And so taking a deeper dive into the financial aspect of pregnancy, when did you start purchasing items for pregnancy? I'm guessing like maybe in the first trimester, not sure yet, but of course in the second and third trimester, maybe that might be when people would start purchasing things, but how about for yourself?
Yes. So I think I truly started purchasing things near the end of my first trimester when I was confident the pregnancy was continuing. I'd also had a miscarriage in the past, so I was being very cautiously optimistic. So I didn't start anything actually till probably about 14 to 16 weeks. I also read on that topic, I read a very important book at the time that I got out from the library, which I think was called Minimalist Mom. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was actually really good because it laid out in very simple terms the things that you absolutely need and the things that you don't need and the things that are maybe a little bit more gimmicky or that aren't actually essential. And I think that was really important because it said, you really only need 10 sleepers in each size. And you do want to budget for, the sleeper's getting dirty. So you'll want some, you need about 10, you'll go through about 5 a day, and you'll do laundry every X, Y, Z. So it was really good because I think it helped me conceptualize what I really truly needed and what were frills. Because when you walk into a baby store, there are a lot of frills.
Yeah.
And it also talked a lot about, the book was about just buy, for example, only white socks. So you never lose socks. And it was very practical. And I really appreciated that practicality when I started to think about what I needed, considering my salary at the time.
Yeah, and that's a good recommendation. I'll try to look for it on Amazon and post it in the description and link it above as well. And then there's also the other aspect of EI, or employment insurance, because as a salaried employee, you're probably going to be collecting EI either before giving birth and quite a lot after giving birth. And generally for the general audience, if you're an employee, you can qualify for EI if you've worked at least 600 hours in the past 52 weeks. I've done a video about this in the past. I can link that as a resource in the description. But for yourself, what was your experience with the application process for EI?
Yeah. So I was lucky because some of the residents ahead of me had created a little bit of a guide about what you had to do, which is actually one of the things I used when I created the website. So now everybody has access to the website that we created. And there's a section about what you would have to do when you start to go on leave as a medical resident. But I decided at the time that I wanted to maximize my leave after the child was born. And so I didn't actually choose to go off any earlier than my induction date and my due date. And so I chose to only start my EI with the birth of my child. You do get 85%. I think it's about 85%. It might be 82%.
Top up, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I did factor in that I would get 6 months of the Paro EI top up. So the EI amount is 55% of your weekly wages until a certain number. So in 2022, it was around $630 something. But then your resident salary would allow top up. And so to apply for that and get that all into place from the payroll standpoint, I had to submit a special form that was provided to me by my program admins that was then submitted to the payroll department. So it was actually logged that I would be eligible for that top up. And then it was my responsibility to apply for EI. You have to apply for EI within 4 weeks of your child's birth in order to access the maternity leave and the parental leave. And you do have to be careful when you're applying for that because you apply for it online. You have to remember to do it around the birth of your child. And you have to make sure that as the birthing parent, you are selecting the maternity leave and the parental leave option and not the parental leave option, because the parental leave option does not include that extra 17 weeks that you're entitled to as the birthing parent. So you have to make sure you select that component. And then the application online is fairly simple, but you do require some of those details, like when the child is going to be born. And if you choose to apply before your child is born, you'll have to go into the system and change the date. And so I chose to do it within that first week after my child was born. And the reason why I emphasize that point is because I made that mistake and I picked the parental leave option because I didn't really think about it. And then later I had to go through, a bunch of phone calls to get it switched back. And they told me they were doing it for me as a favor. I don't know. I'm sure they have many people who do that. But just something to keep in mind that if you're the birthing parent, you should actually be selecting that option when you're on the website. The application form is actually fairly easy in terms of filling that out. And you do need your SIN number and the birth of your child, and then how many weeks you're intending to take approximately. And then you also will have to let so the application into the system for your top up is fairly automatic, but I used to email payroll just to confirm that I was on leave and that my top up would be starting. The other thing you have to do in Ontario very specifically is you do have to let your payroll know the name of your child to add to your benefits application. So you do just in that same email, you could say, I had a child, they were born, please add them to my benefits. And also I'm just making sure that my top up is going to be applied. And then you start getting paid. There's a bit of a grace period of about a week. I think my top-up payments were actually even longer than that. I don't think I received them until about a month after. So there was a time when I was receiving no income, to keep in mind, especially if you don't have a partner who's working, of course, before before you actually start getting your EI, and then you start getting your top-up.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because for that period of time, some people might draw from their line of credit or their savings. And then you said that you can apply for EI within the first 4 weeks. So to prevent delays, ideally, you would want to apply as soon as possible. But of course, things like that can fall by the wayside if you're really busy.
Absolutely.
The other thing is, did you also use vacation time and sick leave to try to increase the time you get off as well?
Yes, so you absolutely can use sick leave. So I would encourage anybody who is struggling with any third trimester complications or any reason that you need to be off work during that time that is medically supported to be using sick leave rather than activating maternity leave sooner, because you actually have access to up to 6 months of sick leave through our contract. And so you could be using that in your third trimester or any time in your residency if you needed to, rather than activating that maternity leave. And you'll get paid more on sick leave than you're going to get on your leave, and it compounds the time. And in terms of vacation, so you actually will accrue, and this was all negotiated in Paro specifically. So be mindful of that if you're from any other province. And our website is a great resource to look at your provincial specific resources because we have links to all of them. But Paro specifically allows us to accrue vacation time while we're on leave. So if you choose to take off a year, you accrue an extra 4 weeks of time. I was off for 9 months, and I'd also saved 2 weeks from my previous year that I hadn't used at the time that I went off. And so I ended up having an additional month where I was paid my full salary as vacation time that I could either tack on to the beginning or the end of my leave. If I tacked it on at the beginning, it would have just been the 2 weeks that I accrued before, and then I could have tacked on more at the end. But I chose to save it all. And then at the end, I added a whole extra month to my leave, where I basically came back to the program, but I was on vacation and I was paid my full salary.
And so it sounds like for your first son, it was 10 months of parental leave in total. Was that the extended, like you took an extended leave, or was
No,
that regular?
it was the standard leave.
Okay.
So I had 6 months where I received my 85% top
Oh,
up.
I see.
And then there were 3 months that I only received my standard EI payments. So my salary, was 600 and something a week. And then for the last month that I came back, that was my full pay of vacation time.
I see. And on a side note, for someone who is not a resident, let's say you're a practicing physician, often what the public doesn't know is that for doctors who are sole proprietors, they're not employees, they don't have access to EI and top up. So one of the challenges doctors would face is finding a locum to cover their practice. And if they can't find one, they would, I don't know, maybe close their practice. There is, however, a pregnancy and parental leave benefits program, or PPLBP, which gives up to a maximum of $1,300 per week, and that can help financially as well. This you might or may not be able to answer this question, but do you have any advice or tips on applying for PPLBP and taking pregnancy leave as a physician?
Yes. So I have a few things to think about. Again, there is a new section on our website that you can look through for more specific suggestions for practicing physicians with links to various resources on this topic. But I would take a look at the application form for the PPLBP and make sure that you understand all the requirements of it, because it can get stressful when you have a newborn to try to figure out what you need to apply for. You can actually, and some people do choose to work a little bit during that time. So you do get $1,300 a week through the PBLBP, but you can choose to supplement that income by additional $1,300. So maybe you decide that you're going to do an extra clinic or part-time clinic that week. Just be mindful that your income stays below the bracket to allow you to receive that whole benefit.
Yeah.
And it is calculated based on your previous work until that time. So if you, for example, as a fellow, if you graduated, it would be calculated partly based on your fellow salary or your resident salary, and whatever else earnings, what other earnings you may have had at that time. And you have to have had your independent practice license for 26 weeks actually before you can apply for it. So you may not actually be eligible for it for a little while. But if you're in fellowship, for example, and you've held your independent practice license the whole time, you can't apply for it until you're actually an independent practice. So you can't utilize it in your fellowship because if you're in a PARO supported fellowship, you can't utilize it. So for example, I can't actually access that, even though I have an independent practice license, but my practice license time and that 26 weeks would actually account for the time that I had the license during my fellowship, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the thing with the PPLBP that is different from what you get as a resident is you don't get as long of a time off. It's around 17 weeks. That's how long the payout would be. So for a lot of doctors, if they need additional time off, that's when they might draw funds from their corporation to help smooth their income and make sure that they still have some income for those other months. Other doctors might even consider, if you're family medicine, you might consider joining something called a FO, a family health organization, where it's capitation payments. It might help give you that income for your locum during that time because you're not relying on billing fee for service. And some other doctors might not want to do this program at all and want to go through EI, in which case they would be salaried and they might join something called a CHC, a community health center type of practice, so that they get a salary, they get health and dental benefits, as well as EI and maternity leave. So moving on to the next question, there is quite a lot of work that goes into being pregnant, but there's even more work after you give birth. Can you kind of talk about how you balance your career with breastfeeding, changing diapers, and all that work that goes into taking care of a baby?
Yes. Is it okay if I go back to your previous comment just
Sure.
for 1 second?
Yeah, no problem.
So about the PPLBP,
PPLBP.
PPLBP. Two things about that I just wanted to mention as well. One thing is sometimes residents debate whether they should go on leave during PARO or if they should graduate and access that resource, especially when they're delivering around that time of June or July. And it actually makes more sense when you do the calculations to go on your leave a little bit early. So say you're delivering July 10th. It actually makes more sense to take your maternity leave a little bit early and access your PARO benefits and your PARO top-ups than to access the PBLBP in terms of income levels.
Exactly.
And you may have to do those personal calculations, but it is important to kind of think about. I've had several questions about that. And then the other thing is that there's a question about stopping and starting. With the PBLBP, it applies to both partners. If you're both physicians, you can both access 17 weeks each, but you can also pause and restart it during that first year. So you have to take it in 2-week increments, but you could take 2 weeks and then you could take 2 weeks like in 3 months from now and still access those funds. You can't do that in residency. So there is a little bit of a difference. With EI, you can't actually, your employer gets to decide, so it's not in our Employment Standards Act, your employer gets to decide if you are able to break it up. So even though the EI payments can be broken up according to the government, your employer, which is your hospital association and your program, can actually decide whether you can take it in increments. So say you wanted to take 1 month at the beginning and then you wanted to wait 3 months and then take a second month, you actually may not be able to do that if your program and your employer are not supportive of that. So even though you may have heard of people being able to do that, it is an employer-specific determination.
Great, thanks for mentioning that. So in terms of the question about, after you give birth, how did you balance your career with everything that comes with all of that?
Yes, so definitely some big considerations for people are breastfeeding. So if you choose to breastfeed, and important to recognize here that breastfeeding is very challenging, so it's absolutely okay, whatever choice you make. But if you choose to breastfeed, you can actually choose to breastfeed for 2 years now, I believe is the recommendation by the Pediatrics Society. And so a lot of people will actually make it their goal to breastfeed exclusively for about 6 months, and ideally in their own perception of what they would like to do for their child, it'll be about a year that most people will breastfeed for. So that may mean that you choose to return to work while you're still breastfeeding. So the important thing to to budget for is your breast pump. So that will be covered actually, usually Pero now covers it just as of July 1st, 2022 or 2023. That cost is about $300 to $600, depending on what type of pump you choose to get. And you do need to budget for that in your work day. So when you come back, depending on how old your child is, if you come back at 6 months, you're going to need to pump probably 2 or 3 times a day, plus overnight if you're on call. But if you're coming back a little bit later when your child is older, then you may be able to modulate when you're actually pumping. So those are things that you may have to factor into both your budget and your schedule in terms of feeding your child. The way the contract is actually written, you are supposed to be accommodated to breastfeed or chest feed as you want to. So that doesn't necessarily mean pump either. If you have a partner or a nanny who's willing to bring your child to wherever you are, or you need to, if you live close by and you want to go breastfeed actually your child instead of pumping and then come back, technically you would be protected to do that under the contract. So also something to kind of keep in mind, that breastfeeding does not always equal breast pumping. If that's something that you wanted to be accommodated, it's possible to do so. The other kind of piece of both finances and scheduling is childcare, a very, very big component to think about when you're returning to work. So there are different models of childcare. The models that we know of course, include daycares. And daycares, you have to think about hours, and you'll want to be very careful to look into the hours of the daycares that you're applying to. It's a very competitive market here in Toronto, especially, but in different cities, they have different competition markets. So in general, most people will get on multiple wait lists when they're still pregnant if you're trying to access those daycares. Now, interestingly, in my case, I chose to move. And so all the daycare wait lists that I chose were for my old place. And when I moved to my new place, I was on no daycare wait list. So I didn't actually get into a daycare anywhere close to where I was. And so there's that, you have to kind of think about that. Your wait lists don't move. There's no centralized wait list. You're just calling up a bunch of daycares and asking to be on your wait list, and you may never hear from them again. So another important consideration. The other form of childcare is to get a nanny. So you can either choose to have a solo nanny, so somebody that comes just for you and you define the hours and the job description, or you can choose to share a nanny, which is actually what a lot of residents will choose to do. So there may be a co-resident in their cohort, or they're in a neighborhood where there are a lot of nannies around, and you can actually have 2 to 3 kids per nanny, depending on how comfortable that nanny is with that group. And that cuts the costs for you in terms of having a bit more flexibility in your childcare, but still having maybe a little bit better hours or reliability compared to daycare. The nuances here, of course, are going to be cost. The other thing to factor in is sick days. So the issue with daycare is that if your child has a sniffly nose or fever or runny diarrhea, they will be sent home, and you won't know until the morning of, and that will mess up your own schedule. And you need to have a contingency plan between you and your partner about what's going to happen in those situations. With a nanny, you have maybe a bit more flexibility in the sense that, okay, you can leave your sick child with your nanny, but if your nanny chooses to take the day off for vacation, or they themselves are sick, or something happens, then you will also need a contingency plan. So sometimes nannies are a bit more reliable than daycare, but they're still an employee, and they're still entitled to vacation, and there will still be unpredictabilities in their schedule that you need to, as a couple, create a backup plan for. And some people in residency will actually choose to have a backup colleague. So I've heard of people saying, you and I are backup colleagues on this rotation. If something happens to me, like, you're going to cover for me, and whether that's call or rounding or whatever it is, I've certainly heard of those people having arrangements. And some people, and staff talk about that too. I've certainly heard about, different surgeons saying, well, I have my brother, or I have this person who could step in for me and take over for me if this situation ever happened. But you can tell that they've thought about these contingency plans so that they have a pathway in their mind about what they're going to do if something like this happens. And then the last point on childcare is if you are in a daycare, for example, and your hours are 7:30 to 6, but your rotation is 7 to 8 or something like that, You can actually talk to your Office of Learner Affairs or your wellness office to speak to them about what the possibilities are in terms of accommodations. And you can talk to your program about what are the options in terms of rotation accommodations so that you can still accomplish your goals to get your residency experience and meet your residency program requirements, but you are able to accommodate these important life activities like caring for a child and working with the daycare hours that are present. And then the last bit of childcare that I will mention is that many people have family support around. And this is the time that you lean on your family support when you're a resident, especially, and you kind of need somebody, or even in my situation, my family actually doesn't live in the city. We don't have family in the city, but I have wonderful neighbors who actually are willing to step in when there is something that happens. We actually will text one of them and say, could you watch our child for an hour while this happens, and they will say, okay, yes, no problem. So we sometimes forget to think about supports outside of just family, but you may have friends that are able to do so. You may have neighbors that you can rely on. There may be other trusted people in your life that you could call in to help you in situations like that.
Mm-hmm. And I also heard about the $10 daycare program, or the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. That will probably be implemented by 2026. But was that a program that you were thinking of applying for, or have any advice around that particular program?
Yes. So in the last few years, things have been a little bit touch and go in terms of that program because daycares have the option to opt into the program, and not all daycares opt in. So certainly the ones that are under the program actually probably have longer wait lists. So you need to get on that wait list almost at conception, basically, if you want that daycare and it's close to you. And everybody I know who really wants a daycare has applied to multiple daycares. Like we're talking 10 to 20 daycares that they're on wait lists for, and you never know which one will call you. The other thing that's kind of a hidden secret in terms of daycares is, even though they have a wait list and it's supposed to be some sort of organization, you are supposed to bug them a little bit. So as you're getting closer and closer, you're supposed to message them and say, hey, where am I on your wait list? And it's almost like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I hear of many people who get their spots because they pestered the daycare until basically there was a spot available. Even though you may have been higher on that list, you still hear of somebody else getting it. And so there is kind of that element to all the daycares that you do have to bug them a little bit and be on them for them to give you that spot. Because a spot will become available and it'll be the first person that emails that they're like, oh, okay, we'll just give you the spot. But in terms of the $10 a day daycare, so I never actually accessed it. I do have a nanny and I'm very happy with my nanny situation. But I know that it's coming in phases until 2026. So the fees are slowly decreasing with time. And there are some daycares that are not opted in. So if that is important to you, you should ask them, are you going to be in the governmental daycare program? Will your fees be reducing with time? Because people may also not be as transparent about it. So you'll want to be very careful to be on the specific waitlists where you're actually going to get cost savings. Otherwise, the costs will be private-based costs, the costs that we were all used to paying before, and your costs are higher with the younger the child. So $2,500 to $3,000 a month if your child is under 18 months, down to about $1,600 or so when your child is in the range of 2 to 3 years old.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to like family and the nannies and daycares, let's talk about your partner throughout all of this. What advice do you have for partners when it comes to providing support throughout this pregnancy and birth process?
Yes, me and my partner are 50-50 parents. I will tell you that, we actually, again, a recommendation, we discovered this kind of system or this book called Fair Play, which actually worked very well for us to introduce this concept of we each have different tasks and we carry the tasks through from conception to planning to execution. So actually the book did a really good job of just talking about this concept about how, typically it's a lot of female mental load to think about, oh, well, what are we going to have for dinner? And then we'll tell our male partner, this isn't a heterosexual relationship, of course, we're telling our male partner, go buy these groceries. And then that creates issues when it's like, oh, you didn't buy exactly what I wanted. And so it really does a good job of of separating things and saying, okay, well, if this person is planning all the dinners, then that person also has to get all the groceries for that dinner and make sure that it's made on time. And it takes off the mental load. So you split up activities that way. And so for us, it's worked really well. And so when I say 50-50, I mean, for example, my husband does all the cooking in the house. I don't enjoy cooking, so he does all of that. He does all the grocery shopping. I don't enjoy doing that, and I don't even think about it. It's just off my mental load. But there are things that I think about. So, for example, I'm responsible for all the schooling decisions. So I get my child ready for school. I make my child's lunch. I have to read through all the emails, which are a lot when you have a school-aged kid, and you have to plan all those things. So we have we have task divisions, and that really helps us. And we also, for example, he's the healthcare person, so he has to take the kids to all of the doctor's appointments. But we split sick days. So if we have our nanny is sick or child needs care, then like it depends based on our schedule. So I'll say, oh, I'm less busy this day, so I will take today off, and you're less busy, so you'll take that day off. But we do have kind of backup processes. So if we have something really busy in our lives, like he is planning for a trial or I'm in the operating room, we let each other know, these few days or this day, I'm not going to be very flexible. And the other person is kind of expected to be flexible in those situations. And it's fairly rare when we're both very busy at the same time. But if we are, we will activate our backup system. So we'll let like our family know and say, this week we're both really super busy. Could you keep us in mind if we need you for anything? And we're lucky to have that support around. But I would say in our home, probably the thing that helps us both achieve our goals is that parenting and being with our kids is very important to both of us. And we're both willing to accept 50% responsibility for that. And that means different things in terms of how we've divided up our tasks.
And when it comes to budgeting, do you guys also do 50-50 for all of the childcare expenses as well?
What do you mean by that?
Like, for example, purchasing clothing, daycare costs, diapers. Do you all buy that through like a joint account, or each of you individually, like whoever does the groceries will also buy the diapers, or do you kind of do it that way?
Yeah, so my husband and I have completely joint finances. So we have a single bank account, we have a single credit card. I have my line of credit, which I suppose is separate and it's attached to me personally, but everything else in our life is actually shared. And for us, that really works in terms of our budget and our lifestyle and our planning, because it never brings into this question of who is paying for what and how are we splitting that up. And that's just, between the two of us, that's what has worked for us.
Sounds good. And so it looks like we've covered a lot of topics today, from the planning process to pregnancy to postpartum. So I'm just going to move on to 5 rapid fire questions where you can answer in 1 to 2 words or longer if you want to. So question number 1, other than your website, which I'll link all of the times you've referenced it in and timestamp them, what are your favorite resources for getting information on family planning? So you've mentioned books, but anything like online forums, podcasts, etc.?
So for family planning specifically, I don't think I have, I'm the resource, I'm the fertility doctor. So that's like a bit of a personal thing. But in terms of other things like family building and, how do I plan things in terms of my career, I certainly have mentors that I talk to. I don't really have like unfortunately, a specific resource around that. In terms of parenting, I use a lot. I have different things on my Instagram that I follow there's a lot of resources on Instagram, actually, if you look for different parenting experts, and that's very dependent on your style. But I actually get a lot of information about, like, for example, like Solid Starts is a baby weaning website, and I found out about that on Instagram. So you'll find things that fit your personality, I think, on those social media forums, and that will lead you to read more if you want to.
Sounds good. Number 2, what is the most worth it purchase for new moms or for a baby shower?
Hard one for me too. Probably like a standby as sleepers. Like you probably can't have enough of those because your kid will vomit or do something on them.
Okay. Number 3, where do you go to buy pregnancy or childcare stuff for a good price?
So furniture, IKEA for sure, like very good quality. And otherwise, in terms of clothing and things like that, like Old Navy sales, Joe Fresh sales, H&M sales, all those sort of big box stores will have very cheap baby stuff that's usually of pretty good quality and lasts for the time that you need it.
Wonderful. Okay. Number 4, what's a favorite travel destination when you've got kids?
Um, So just as a reminder, wherever you go, you still have to parent.
Yeah.
So, and your kids are going to be super dysregulated. So try to pick a location where you're going to have a chance not to do a lot and it's actually not going to put a lot of pressure on you. So me and my partner have actually chosen not to travel very much while
Okay.
our kids are young because it's a lot of work. We traveled to see my brother and we're planning to go to Disney World, but the concept is just with the kids, it's for the kids, nothing's for us, and
Right.
we are going to be busy and parenting the whole time.
Okay. And number 5, what's your best relationship advice?
Um, Find a partner who is willing to be 50-50 with you in everything that you do together and be kind to each other.
Wonderful. So that brings us to the end of office hours. Thank you, Dr. Shirin Dason, for sharing your expertise and lived experience with us today. And if you have any questions for Shirin, please leave them in the comments below. Or how else can people who are watching find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the website, if you message on the website or you send an email, it gets to me.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for watching.